Welcome to another episode of the AppSec Insiders Podcast. This is a show where we discuss the hottest topics and latest trends in application and cloud security and tell you what you need to know. For those who don't know who we are, we're all software developers, we're white hat hackers, we're code security experts, and when we're not recording this podcast, we help organizations of all sizes with their cybersecurity needs at Forward Security. If you're an AppSec professional and you're looking for an opportunity to work with some of the best in the industry, or if you're a developer with an interest in cybersecurity, be sure to check out our careers page at forwardsecurity.com/careers. We would greatly appreciate if you would subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to the show, and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at Forward Security. Links are in the show notes. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing a roundup of some of the most important or interesting threats and newcomers to the security world for 2023. And joined with me, I have Farshad.
Hey, everybody.
And Jordan.
Hi there.
So why don't we start with something that we had talked about earlier in March. There was something that had come out about Outlook. So Outlook had this vulnerability in it, a zero-click vulnerability, which just now, as of today, there's been an announcement that a new version of this vulnerability has been reported and actively being exploited in the wild. So what is it? You may have seen our video on it earlier. I made a little short, but it's essentially this. Outlook has the ability to play a sound. I mean, just like any calendar app, when there's an event, you can actually customize what sound gets played when that event comes up as a little reminder ding or whatever. But there's an interesting sort of, I can't remember if it was documented or if it was just a very hidden, but if it was a documented but hidden feature or completely undocumented, there was a feature that allowed you to send that request to Outlook and actually tell Outlook what audio file to play when that event wanted to remind you that of its presence. And then that was combined with another vulnerability that allowed you to basically, there was a vulnerability in the parsing of the audio. And so it could lead to all sorts of things like remote code execution and stuff like that. And so now we're seeing this exploited in the wild. So you could have it connect to SMB servers and look for audio files off of your network, and there was all sorts of interesting vulnerabilities surrounding that. And you guys, while I was joining this call before we started recording the podcast, you were looking at the article that talked about the latest version of this. Were there any updates that I haven't seen?
No updates to that article. But Jared, what was interesting is as I was trying to find the original one, I typed in, Outlook notification wave vulnerability, and then an article came up from today talking about two vulnerabilities that are related to it, which was, I guess, surprising, not surprising, given that there's always lots of vulnerabilities in the Microsoft ecosystem.
Yeah. Do we have a CVE number for this? Does anybody still have that open?
Yeah. So the original CVE that came out in March, that was CVE 2023-23397.
Mm-hmm.
That one, they categorized it as an elevation of privilege CVE. And it basically got a critical rating. So like a 9.8 CVSS rating is pretty high.
Yeah.
And they also said that it impacts all Windows Outlook versions. And essentially what that was, as you mentioned, attacker sends an email with a malicious extended MAPI. And for the audience, if you don't know, MAPI is the message application programming interface that's used by Windows and Microsoft products. So then that would trigger an exploit via UNC, which is the Universal Naming Convention. It's a path that would give the remote attacker control to the SMB, like a location in SMB. And it would happen without any user interaction. So even before the message is previewed, which is kind of scary, right? Like someone who sent you an email, you're not even previewing the message just by the virtue of being used by Outlook, then that exploit would happen. It would allow the attacker to elevate their privilege and bypass authentication. The two that we just discovered today, as we Googled the old one, these came out in just like today. One of them was actually submitted in August, and it officially became a CVE now. The first one is the CVE 2023-35384. That one has only got a CVSS rating of 5, which is, in the middle. And it allows you to bypass certain security features But when combined with another one that also came out today, that ends with 36710, that one gives you remote code execution vulnerability. So if you combine those two, essentially, there could be bad times had there, right? So what they're saying is that so the first one, the 35384 that was discovered now, that one exploits a vulnerability in the Windows HTML engine. They call it the Windows HTML platform. And for the audience, if you're not familiar with that, basically it's a set of components that in Windows that are used for rendering and working with HTML content. So things like Microsoft's HTML engine that's used by applications like Internet Explorer and Teams and other parts of the Windows ecosystem that parse and display HTML documents. And so these platforms are pretty important in how Windows interacts with the web content, and they can affect everything from like browsers to applications that rely on rendering HTML, like Outlook. So that's what the one vulnerability targets, and then the second one is related to allowing you to do remote code execution. So all bad things and somewhat related.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, I'm remembering now. So the original one, actually, I misspoke earlier, wasn't a remote code execution, but the reason it's an escalation of privilege is because you could supply an SMB path for that audio file. And so Windows would try to connect to that SMB using authentication, and it would send along the NTLM hash, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you would be able to capture somebody's, and then potentially use a pass the hash or something like that if you're able to, if you're on the network or they have exposed Active Directory services.
Mm-hmm.
So I think so that was super interesting. There was another one that was really interesting, another topic that we looked at. So to give an overview of some of the stuff I want to get through, I want to talk about the LastPass hacks, and Jordan will be able to talk to us about that. And there was one, Farsha, there was one that I thought that you had a lot of information on. I can't remember what it was. Do you remember?
So we want to talk to the audience, I think, about the CASA framework that was that we recently also discovered. It's a fairly new development. We wanted, I think, to also maybe touch on the Passkey or passwordless. I know that's a topic that Jared is pretty close to home for you. I think those were some of the highlights, and providing some updates and changes that have happened to OWASP.
Right. Yes, it was the OWASP app. That's what I was thinking of, was that OWASP's app was moving from the OWASP Foundation to the Linux Foundation. But actually, I'm more interested to hear about the CASA framework. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
That sounds good. That sounds good. So yeah, it's funny. I was just again searching the internet for something, and then in fact stumbled across this one, and I was like, just when you think you know everything, you just don't, right? Like, and what is that famous saying? The more you know, the less you realize you know.
Yeah.
And so, we live and breathe this stuff. And I was looking for, I can't remember what it was. It was ASVS related. And then I discovered this CASA. Oh, I know what it was. I looked at some company, they had certified themselves for security, and they had the CASA logo. And I'm like, what is this? So I looked it up, and essentially it stands for the Cloud Application Security Assessment, CASA. It's a framework that they've built to enhance application and cloud security, primarily apps that run in the cloud. And it's built on ASVS, right? So we live and breathe ASVS, but ASVS itself, it provides a base set of security controls that are good for applications that are running in the cloud and things like, or not in the cloud. Particularly those. But what they did with CASA, they focused on the ones that are in the cloud, and particularly those that access Google user data. Initially, it was a framework that Google proposed. And now it's they've donated it to the I believe it's part of the App Defense Alliance, which falls under the Linux Foundation. And the objective is to essentially empower users with transparency and control over data security and privacy in applications that they're building and they're using by using this framework, by assessing it and looking at the backend services. What CASA's goal is to mitigate common vulnerabilities and bring up the customer confidence. So, and at its core, it provides guidance on how to test web application controls, and then aligning it with the 14 categories of ASVS, because ASVS doesn't really go into the depth. It just says, sure, you have 3 levels, and if your application is really sensitive, go for level 3. If it's not, go for level 1. Everything else is in the middle. But it doesn't go into specifics of how to test it, who should test what. There's WSTG. WSTG talks about how to test each of those specific controls, but not at a whole, like what approach to take What does the developer test? What should the third-party pen tester test? Where should you focus? So that's what this does, is it introduces a tiers of assessment, focusing on time-limited functional audits of externally accessible interfaces. And
Right.
the approach emphasizes the importance of regular security assessments throughout the development lifecycle, which has been something that's been ignored. I mean, everybody usually just does an annual pen test, and there's not much security testing going on during the development lifecycle in many companies. So that's what the goal of this CASA frameworks is that to really do that, and to all the, so not only does it guide you in enhancing the security posture, but it also aligns with industry standards, making sure that things are pretty robust when you're assessing your applications that are in the cloud.
Right. And this is something that we have pretty much been doing since the onset of our company here.
Yeah, exactly. That's what got me excited, because one of the big things it talks about in CASA says, hey, you shouldn't just do an annual pen test. What you should be doing is the developers and the third party should partner up. By partnering up, the developer is expected to be testing certain ASVS controls on a regular basis through automation, creating automated test scripts, SAS-SCA, and then getting that coverage. And then when it's time for the annual pen tester, or that, let's call it tester, because pen testing doesn't solve all your problems when it comes to application security. So when the third-party tester comes in, they ingest the results from the development team saying, hey, you've been running these tests, it's been covering half of ASVS. So you just get that report, and instead of running those test cases yourself, you just look at what they passed and failed, and then you augment it with all the manual activities that couldn't be automated or the developers couldn't do. So they propose I think it's 3 different models, where in one of them, the developers test everything, pen tester tests everything as well. And then for less critical applications, that third party does less, and then the team does more, and things like that. We'll put the link in the show notes. I highly encourage people that are listening to the show to check it out, because it's not enough just to do an annual pen test. There are several problems with it. Number one, if you just do it once a year, it's analogous to say, hey, Jared, you have that antivirus on your computer. Could you turn it off all year long and just turn it on once a year? You tell me, Farshad, you're crazy. Like, I'm going to turn that on all the time. I'm going to update it all the time, because there's 0 days, right? But for some reason, when it comes to applications, we don't think that way. We think that turning on the antivirus, i.e. getting the quote unquote pen tester to come in once a year, it's enough, but it's not. You need to have continual coverage. So that's what the goal of this CASA framework is. And then beyond that, let the audience know here that pen testing just is not enough. When you're testing software, you need to be doing source code reviews, you need to be doing design reviews and threat modeling, and augmenting it with pen testing, because pen testing is only going to cover the portion of the code that is from the libraries and things that are vulnerabilities that are published. And a majority of the code that companies build out there is brand new bespoke code that isn't published yet. So pen testing is not going to find problems in most of your software.
Yeah, exactly.
One other thing I found interesting about the CASA is they have their own, it's almost like a certification, right? They have they call it getting tier 2. I'm looking at the website, CASA tier 2 verification. So basically they sort of have this self analysis process where you do your scan, and then you look at like a subset of requirements, and then you can actually submit those to CASA and get CASA certified. So that's pretty interesting, because I know with ASVS and MASVS, they explicitly say, this isn't a certification. Anybody who says, that you're level 2 ASVS certified or whatever, that's non-existent, right? But so it seems like with this, they're sort of creating that certification.
Yeah, and they have a tool I saw that was it helps to create a subset of the ASVS items. So they've taken a subset of ASVS items that they find to be most relevant, and then they have a tool where you can filter down. You can tell it, our app is for mobile, but it's also for web and has an API. And if you select those things, it gives you a subset of ASVS items to look for, which is pretty cool.
Jared, glad you brought it up. Exactly, because what they're trying to do is they recognize that teams are busy. They don't have time to test everything. So what they want to do is help you scope only the things that are really important. And then the other thing they do is they look at other frameworks and standards as well. For example, SOC 2, etc. Because a lot of companies, and our clients included, they have to also abide by SOC 2 and other things. So what they do is they say, hey, which compliance frameworks apply to you? Hey, SOC 2, sure, etc. And then they create that minimal subset that is the most important stuff you should focus on. So that is another, that scoping tool that they have also helps companies really test things that are important to their software. I mean, granted, if you have more time and budget, ideally you would test lots of stuff, but the reality is that a lot of companies don't. And that certification is also really nice because, as you said, Jordan, ASVS didn't really support that. And I think that's the goal of CASA, is to use ASVS controls as a foundation and build a framework that allows companies to do testing right and then ideally get certified.
Is the CASA framework working with OWASP? Do you know, is there some relation between the two of them?
I don't know. I think that's worth exploring because I know that it's tied together. Like CASA is built on top of ASVS. So I would imagine without ASVS, CASA wouldn't be anything. So I would imagine there's probably close collaboration, but it's worth exploring. Our ASVS representative, Iman, who has actually recently was asked to join their the ASVS authors group, would be the person to ask. And yeah, we can definitely ask him when he comes back.
Cool. Beyond that, before we move on to our next topic, which will be about Jordan's going to enlighten us on some of the LastPass stuff that happened this year. I want to talk about some events that are happening. So keep an eye out for, if you're in the Vancouver area, which Farshad is and the rest of our company is, there is OWASP Vancouver. Those meetups happen every third Thursday of the month. There's also the Van City Sec, which is the first Thursday of every month, which is kind of more of a hangout with you come and you get to meet some cool people in the industry. And then there's the DC 604, the DEF CON Vancouver chapter. There's also in Toronto, if you're around my area, we've got the DC 416. That generally happens every month. I think we've taken December off because, it's always tough with the holidays, but we'll be back in January. Usually happens in the EY building, which you find, I think it's 1 York Street or close to there, just like Lakeshore and Spadina or something like that. I don't know. I took an Uber to get there, so I don't remember the exact intersection. And then there's OWASP Toronto, which does also happen with some regularity, but again, because of December, didn't happen this month. So look out for that in January. And now, ding 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 with the report on recent hacks in our password managers. We go over to Jordan with our eye in the sky. Ding 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 ding.
Yeah, so this one actually, I mean, I think it happened a while ago. I think it happened, well, a while ago as in September.
3 months ago.
Yeah, there were a few different disclosures. I think the last disclosure was in February, but basically LastPass, the most recent happenings is that they got a hold of, I think, all of, or at least a big portion of users' encrypted vaults. And there's a few interesting things to talk about. The first one is how they got a hold of those, right? And so how they got a hold of those was basically a LastPass employee was working from home, and it must have been some sort of targeted attack. But basically they had their own media server. They had a Plex media server, which I'm sure a lot of folks know is for hosting videos, legal or illegal, so that you can serve them to your various devices, your various clients on your home network. And basically there was an RCE vulnerability in that software. And so, again, somehow that employee was targeted, and through that RCE vulnerability, there was some keylogging software, keylogging malware that they call it, that was implanted. And in doing that, these threat actors got a hold of basically the keys to the kingdom, this DevOps engineer's LastPass corporate vault. So they got access to that. So they got access to the credentials. It says that they were using MFA, but somehow I think maybe they bypassed that, or I guess they probably got somehow got access to that code and used that to log in.
So I know that one thing that they could have done, because of some of the engagements that we do, is they could have used a program called EvilJinx, which is built off of Nginx, right? Which is why it gets that name. But essentially, it is it's kind of like a reverse proxy or a man in the middle for login for any service, right? So you basically somebody goes to your fake domain and you have it set up with that server where it takes what they're actually trying to log into. So in this case, LastPass or LastPass admin, and funnels it through your server. So to them, even though the domain is off, everything else on the page is accurate and it all gets funneled through your server. So you get to see the credentials they send, and that includes their multi-factor code. And sometimes you don't even need to capture the multi-factor code. All you're looking for is the session token you get at the end of it, which also would come through your server.
There you go. Yeah.
Wow.
So, this raises there's a couple interesting things that we can talk about. But one thing I want to talk about was basically, okay, it was bad. They were accessing this stuff from home, right? Probably shouldn't have been I mean, they probably should have been using like a corporate machine, their work laptop or whatever at the very least. But the other thing is there were only 4 LastPass employees with access to that. I think in the whole company, it says with access to this corporate vault. So what I'm curious about, and Farsha, I want to ask you about this is, a lot of people talk about zero trust these days, about, how nobody should have access to that, or you should use something like PAM, or something like that. So what do you think is happening behind the scenes at LastPass? Do you think they're making some changes? Should these 4 employees still have those kind of access to that vault, etc.?
Jordan, you hit it on the head with privileged access management, right? Like no one should have long-standing to privileged accounts. Doesn't matter if it's 1 or 4, because what I mean by long-standing is I have a username and password, and at any given point, I can use that username and password to log in, right? What should happen is some sort of a workflow or privileged identity control, where when I need to access that, I go and request access through a ticketing system, and then 1 or 2 things could happen. Either I'm running in an environment where it's like everything is identity based. So in that case, my identity will then be permitted to access certain services for a certain period of time. Or if you're not working in a space where your workloads are running under identities, then you can get temporary passwords. So then a temporary credential set would be issued to you. You can use that username and password and go and do what you want to do. And that's all logged. However, in many companies, that is not the case. People have long-standing permanent privileged access. And when those people are compromised, then you end up with this type of a situation in your hand. So and we had I know the financial sector went through a huge audit. I know when I worked at HSBC up until 2017, was it 2015 or somewhere in that 2015 to 2017, they came down to all the banks. They're saying, hey, how are you managing your privileged access? So we had to do an audit. It was a huge project. We did an audit and we discovered there were so many longstanding credentials with privileged access. So then we started looking at bringing in proper, management and all that kind of stuff. We looking at solutions like CyberArk or Dell Identity One and things like that. And for the audience of those that are in cloud, a lot of cloud providers have those types of capabilities built in, or you can augment it with third-party software. But the biggest lesson is, no one should have that type of permanent access that's privileged. It should always be controlled. It doesn't matter. But the reality, a lot of small companies, they're too small, right? Like startups, they say, hey, we're not big enough to build those kinds of things in. Then it's sort of a risk that you're taking. You just have to be really careful about those 4 people, where they're working from. Are they going to be working from a cafe? Is their machine got a firewall? Could someone in that remote environment, target their machine? Is their machine updated? Once you take that laptop into other areas that is not the corporate environment, there's lots and lots of considerations to be had that many companies don't think about. So
Yeah, 100%. Thanks for that. Yeah, so the other thing I wanted to talk about was, talk about long standing issues. Like, so basically now these attackers, they have acquired access to these vaults, and you can do offline attacks on the vault, right? Somebody was telling me oh, they've got the vaults, but the encryption key is where if for people who have MFA it's okay, but actually no, it's not okay, right? Because the MFA has nothing to do with it. Like the encryption key is derived from your password, and your password alone, your master password. So You know, now the other problem is LastPass back in the day, I think they're using PBKDF2 and they were using as little as 10,000 iterations of that. This was like, you know, several years ago, and they kept increasing those iterations. Now I think the default is 600,000, but maybe just a year ago, I think it was less than that. It was maybe 100 or 10,000, something like that. So, you know, we're seeing the effects of that now. Like this article, from Krebs on security, he talks about how now, you know, people are cracking those vaults and getting a hold of the seeds to people's
Yeah,
crypto wallets. So,
that's right.
and so, you know, that raises another question: should I be putting my seeds to my crypto wallet in LastPass? And I'd say probably not. You should be printing those out, putting those in a very, very safe place, right?
Well, here's a
But
question: is there a way that LastPass can be your vault for those things, and it would still be safe? Is there something that people can do to make that
I,
okay?
yeah, I guess if you
yeah,
you know think of the offline attack, right? If you protect that data in such a way that it makes it really, really time consuming, that it'll take a very long amount of time to do that offline
That's
brute
what I'm
force
thinking.
on it, then potentially. The other challenge was that they didn't encrypt all the data. From what I understand, they only encrypted the passwords, but like the URL of which site and your username and all that metadata was not encrypted. So when they get your vault, they can see where that itself can be used for reconnaissance. Oh, hey, Farshad has accounts in all these places. Surely, maybe Farshad used a really long password that withstands that offline brute forcing. But once they know where I'm going and what systems I'm using, and there's lots of metadata in there, right? Like it definitely has the URL of the logging page, and it has the user ID and potentially other notes that you might have put in that. And I don't think those were encrypted. So, that lessons be learned is that you should create LastPass, you should encrypt all the data, and then for the users to have selected really strong master passwords.
Yeah. I think that to me is the clinchers. Have a very strong. I mean, the whole idea is with one password, which is a competitor, or LastPass. The whole meaning behind their name is that this should be the last or one password that you should ever have to remember. And so
yep.
make it long, make it complicated. It's the only one you'll ever have to try to remember like that. And then the rest of the passwords all get created by those password managers and handled by and stored and used by them. So don't be afraid to make a 18 character, 20 character, even 16 character. I think even 12 might be okay, but for future proofing, let's say 16 to 24 characters for a password. If you can do a passphrase in your head and throw a couple odd characters here or there, or intentionally misspell words, these are all ways to slow down attackers guessing your passwords.
Exactly.
Yeah. And by slow down, I mean orders of magnitude. If your password is 12 characters and somewhat guessable, it may take several years to crack that password. If you've intentionally misspelled that word, it's not going to be in their dictionary. Or if you've added several words or a passphrase, or added the odd character here or there, a symbol, now we're talking about 10 years, 100 years, right? If it's really long, really complicated, it can take until the heat death of the universe to, at least with modern technology.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Very true. Yeah.
Right, which I think leads us neatly into our next topic, and probably our last topic, just timing wise. This year we've been seeing a huge influx of passwordless logins, meaning passkeys. And I just want to quickly, before we get into that, I just want to say that I have also seen recently a switch from some big companies. I think Slack for sure I know is one. I'm trying to remember some others that I have seen where when you go to log in, instead of putting in your password, it will email you like a 6-digit code. So it's almost like you have multi-factor, but that 6-digit code is your first factor. All right. But it gets sent to your email or to your phone. Which, I don't know about that. That seems to go against what ASPS recommends. But regardless, I think it has, there is something to be said that if your email gets compromised, it's probably endgame there anyways, because most forgot password systems rely on your email. But anyways, I just wanted to quickly mention that before we move into passwordless and passwordless logins and passkeys, because this is something that is starting to get a lot of traction, and I think we're going to see more and more as time goes by. And I'm going to briefly describe the technology behind it, and then I sort of want to have a discussion about the usefulness of it. So essentially, how do you log in without passwords, right? Well, the idea is that you're always logging in on a device that you use a lot, right? So let's say your phone, you're always logging in on your phone. So when you register, your phone creates a private key and a public key, a very strong private key and a public key. And then that public key is what gets sent to the service. So let's say you're logging into the, I don't know, let's make up some service, like Forward Security's web service. Okay. So you go to register, your device sees, okay, this is going to be a passkeyless login. So I will on device create those two keys. I'm going to store the private key on the device and send the public key to forwardsecurity.com, where I'm registering an account. So now the next time I go to log in, I put in my username, and my username gets sent to the server. The server goes, okay, I'm going to look up your public key. Okay, I found your public key here. I'm going to use your public key to either sign or encrypt some data. And then I'm going to send that encrypted or signed data back to you, depending on how they want to implement it. That's why I say or. And then on your side, you use your private key to either sign or decrypt or in some way add data to this challenge to create a response that you send back to the server. And the server goes, oh, okay, so I see you were able to decrypt my response, which means you have the private key, and probably do some other mathematics on it to prove that your challenge was that our challenge was properly responded to. So the idea behind this is pretty cool. You don't have to remember any passwords, and then the only remaining issue is how does this get passed between your various devices, right? And so this might be able to be solved by iCloud or Google Cloud, things where these types of keys can get passed between your devices by logging into different accounts. Any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Jared. I think passwordless is going to be the way to future. So I remember at HSBC one more time, we had a CISO that came in. It was 2015, and he was like, I want to get rid of passwords. And at the time, the solutions weren't quite there. So we tried. We looked at, hey, was Microsoft Windows Hello was starting to offer biometrics. And then we looked at that. We looked at smart cards with public-private keys, with security tokens. Like essentially, what is passwordless? Passwordless authentication is a way of verifying the user identity, as you said, without requiring a password, right? So instead, you would use alternative forms like biometrics data, like your fingerprint, your facial recognition, a security token, a smartphone app, or even SMS that's considered passwordless. So there's different degrees of security. And so we looked at that. We looked at smart tokens, we looked at biometrics, but all of that, the facial recognition Windows Hello wasn't that great. But since 2015 or 2016, things have come a long way. And I always think back about him. I'm like, I always think of that CISO. I'm like, he had a great vision, and what he wanted was in the right direction. It's just the technology wasn't there to support it. And now it's there, and companies can go into supporting passwordless. And the approach enhances the security. It eliminates the risk of password theft or weak passwords, right? And it often improves the user experience because they don't have to remember these complex passwords and all that, all the nightmares that go with it. So, and then these methods typically rely on something that the user has, like a phone or a token, or something that the user is, like their biometric data. And this makes the unauthorized access a lot more challenging for the attackers. So I think, going forward, this is the future, and either go and get your token or a card or an app or whatever it may be, but let's all work together and get rid of passwords. And let's live in that future. So
of course, because also those keys are going to be much more difficult to crack, let's say, than a password.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, I think that about wraps it up. Is there anything else that you feel we can discuss today?
Just want to mention one final thing too. There was another major change in the OWASP world.
Oh yes, please.
So a bunch of the OWASP projects OWASP has lots of projects, right? Some of them are paper projects like standards and policies and OWASP Top 10, ASVS. Some of them are actually products like ZAP or SKF. These are software applications. And as we all know, making software applications takes a lot of time and money, is different than putting together a standard. And these projects needed funding, and OWASP is not designed to fund building applications. The OWASP organization just wasn't really set up for it. So then as a result, ZAP and SKF and all these projects, they need money, they need funding to build these great products. So they decided to, after long discussions, Mark, who was one of the original OWASP co-founders, they suggested to start the software security project. So the software security project would be set up in a way that could fund, essentially it's an up and coming software security community, and it's part of the Linux Foundation, which also includes projects like the CNCF, which is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, OpenSSF, which is the Open Source Security Foundation. And the goal of the SSP is to support the vital security projects and tools by providing financial, operational, and commercial support to make sure that these products are sustainable. And it's set to launch with a variety of incubated projects like ZAP and SKF, and it'll work with the members to establish governance and operational structure. And it'll offer free individual community membership and paid corporate plans. So all that stuff is being solidified, but at the moment, ZAP is no longer an OWASP project, SKF has moved away, and some of those other product type OWASP initiatives will probably move over to this SSP.
Mm-hmm.
So that was worth noting for those that are interested in the world of OWASP and what happened this year.
Right. Yeah. Very cool. All right. Well, I think that is it for our show today. So please subscribe wherever you listen to the show, and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter @ForwardSecurity. All of the links are in the show notes. And if you have any suggestions for topics you'd like us to discuss on a future episode, you can get in contact with us via email or LinkedIn. You can tag us on Twitter at @FWD_SEC. And also a reminder, there are, just to list those events again, we've got OWASP Vancouver, which happens every Thursday of every month. We also have Van City Sec, which is the first Thursday of every month. And then there is DC 604, which happens with some regularity in Vancouver. There's also the DEF CON chapter in Toronto, DC 416, and OWASP Toronto. And you'll see me at most of those as well. What else should I say here? We also have the Eureka platform. So be sure to check that out on our website, forwardsecurity.com, to help with all of your DevSecOps needs. If you're an AppSec professional and you're looking for an opportunity to work with some of the best in the industry, or a developer with an interest in cybersecurity, be sure to check out our careers page at forwardsecurity.com/careers. Lastly, if you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing and sharing with anyone who you think may enjoy listening. That would mean a lot to us. This has been the AppSec Insiders. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.
Happy holidays. All the best. Take care.
Happy holidays and Happy New Year. Merry Christmas.